Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Narrative Nest. I didn't even want a birthday dinner that year. Turning 43 didn't feel like something worth celebrating, not with the quiet heaviness that had settled over my life. But my husband insisted. He said it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind of smile that had become normal in our marriage over the past few years. Just dinner, he told me. Nothing fancy. You deserve it. I told myself to believe him. I told myself that maybe this was his way of trying again. The restaurant was one of those places that looked warmer than it felt, all amber lighting and polished wood, soft jazz floating in the air. The kind of place couples went to pretend everything was fine. Our daughter, Lila, couldn't come because she had a late study session at college, and part of me was relieved. I didn't want her watching us navigate the silence between courses, didn't want her noticing how often her father checked his phone. When we sat down, my husband ordered a bottle of wine without asking me. That should have been my first warning. He used to always ask, used to know my preferences by heart. The waitress arrived with menus, young, maybe mid-20s, with tired eyes and a politeness that felt practiced. She smiled at me a little longer than necessary, like she was studying my face. I remember thinking she reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who. We ordered, made small talk, the kind that fills space but never touches truth. My husband talked about work, about a promotion that might be coming, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. I nodded, smiled, played my role. When the wine arrived, he poured my glass himself, red wine, rich and dark. To you, he said, lifting his glass, to many more birthdays. I lifted mine, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. As I brought it closer, the waitress passed by our table again. She slowed, then stopped. Her hand brushed the edge of the table, and she leaned in just enough that only I could hear her. "Ma'am," she whispered, barely moving her lips, "don't drink that." Time did something strange in that moment. The restaurant noise faded, the music dulled, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I froze with the glass inches from my mouth. "What?" I whispered back, my voice thin. Her eyes flicked to my husband, then back to me. They were wide, urgent. "Please," she said softly, "just don't." And then she straightened up and walked away like nothing had happened. My husband frowned. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone too casual. I set the glass down slowly. "I think so," I said, forcing a smile. Maybe I'll wait." He laughed lightly. "Wait for what? It's your birthday." He picked up his own glass and took a long sip. I watched his throat move as he swallowed, my mind racing. Was this some kind of joke? A mistake? Maybe she'd meant another table. Maybe she was confused. But something in her eyes had felt too real, too afraid. My hands trembled slightly under the table. I tried to steady myself by focusing on details, the clink of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation around us. The waitress didn't come back for a while. When she did, she avoided looking at me. I wanted to call her over to ask what she meant, but fear glued me to my seat. My husband reached for my glass. "If you're not going to drink it, I will," he joked. I reacted without thinking, pulling the glass closer to me. "No," I said, sharper than intended. He stared at me, surprised. "What's gotten into you?" I shook my head. "Nothing. I don't feel like wine tonight." His jaw tightened for just a second before he masked it with a shrug. "Suit yourself." Dinner arrived. I barely tasted my food. Every bite felt like cardboard as my mind replayed the whisper over and over, "Don't drink that." I watched my husband closely, noticing things I'd ignored before, how his foot tapped under the table, how he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, how he didn't ask me how I was feeling, didn't ask what I wanted for my birthday. 5 minutes passed, then 10. My husband shifted in his seat, rubbing his stomach. "This wine's hitting me harder than I thought," he said with a laugh that sounded forced. I felt a cold wave wash over me. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yeah," though his sweat had started to bead at his temple. Just need some air." He stood up too quickly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. People turned to look. He swayed, grabbing the back of the chair to steady himself. My heart pounded. "Sit down," I said, standing too. He opened his mouth to respond, but instead he gagged, a harsh, ugly sound that cut through the restaurant's gentle atmosphere. The waitress appeared instantly, as if she'd been waiting. "Sir," she said loudly, signaling to the manager. My husband doubled over, clutching his stomach, his face drained of color. Panic erupted around us. Someone called for an ambulance. I stood there, frozen, watching the man I'd spent 20 years with collapse on the floor of a restaurant on my birthday. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, his eyes met mine, filled with confusion and something else I couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or guilt. The waitress caught my arm gently. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know how else to warn you." "Warn me about what?" I asked, my voice shaking. She swallowed hard. "I'll tell you," she said, "but not here." The weeks after my husband's arrest moved in strange waves. Some days felt eerily calm, like the world had decided to give me space to breathe. Other days, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down so hard I could barely get out of bed. I kept replaying the same question in my mind. How long had he been planning it? How many times had I unknowingly trusted a man who was quietly arranging my absence from the world? Therapy became a lifeline. Sitting across from a woman with kind eyes and a notebook, I finally said things out loud I'd buried for years. About the way my husband had slowly withdrawn, about the nights he came home late with excuses that didn't quite add up, about the version of myself I'd shrunk into to keep the peace. "You didn't miss the signs," my therapist told me gently. "You survived them." That sentence stayed with me. Lila decided to take the semester off and stay with me. We cooked dinners together, talked late into the night, cried when the truth felt too heavy. One evening, she asked, "Mom, did you ever think he could hurt you?" I stared at the stove, stirring soup I didn't plan to eat. "No," I said honestly. "I thought the worst thing he could do was leave." She nodded slowly. "I think that's what makes this so scary." The legal process dragged on. Depositions, meetings with lawyers, every detail laid bare. Financial records revealed debts I never knew about, secret accounts, withdrawals that matched the dates on Maribel's receipt. Aaron's involvement became clearer too. Text messages, phone calls, plans discussed like business transactions. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated erasure. When the day of the preliminary hearing arrived, I almost didn't go. The idea of seeing him again made my chest tighten. But I went anyway, sitting straight-backed in the courtroom, my hands folded in my lap. He looked smaller than I remembered, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his eyes darting around the room until they found mine. For a moment, something like regret flickered across his face. I looked away. When Maribel testified, her voice shook at first, then steadied as she spoke. She described the bottle, the smell, the way her instincts screamed at her to act. I watched the jurors lean in, watched understanding dawn on their faces. Afterward, I hugged her tightly in the hallway. "You were so brave," I told her. She smiled through tears. "So were you." Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions I refused to answer. I didn't know anyone my pain. Back home, I began reclaiming small pieces of myself. I repainted the bedroom walls a soft blue he'd always said was too cold. I joined a local walking group, letting fresh air and unfamiliar faces remind me that life continued. On my birthday the following year, I didn't go out to dinner. I stayed home with Lila, baked a cake, lit candles, and made a wish, not for happiness, but for honesty. As the trial date approached, fear mixed with determination. I knew the next chapter would be hard, but I also knew this: I was still here, and that mattered more than anything he had tried to take from me. The weeks after my husband's arrest moved in strange waves. Some days felt eerily calm, like the world had decided to give me space to breathe. Other days, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down so hard I could barely get out of bed. I kept replaying the same question in my mind. How long had he been planning it? How many times had I unknowingly trusted a man who was quietly arranging my absence from the world? Therapy became a lifeline. Sitting across from a woman with kind eyes and a notebook, I finally said things out loud I'd buried for years, about the way my husband had slowly withdrawn, about the nights he came home late with excuses that didn't quite add up, about the version of myself I'd shrunk into to keep the peace. You didn't miss the signs, my therapist told me gently. You survived them. That sentence stayed with me. Leela decided to take the semester off and stay with me. We cooked dinners together, talked late into the night, cried when the truth felt too heavy. One evening, she asked, "Mom, did you ever think he could hurt you?" I stared at the stove, stirring soup I didn't plan to eat. "No," I said honestly. "I thought the worst thing he could do was leave." She nodded slowly. "I think that's what makes this so scary." The legal process dragged on. Depositions, meetings with lawyers, every detail laid bare. Financial records revealed debts I never knew about, secret accounts, withdrawals that matched the dates on Maribel's receipt. Aaron's involvement became clearer too. Text messages, phone calls, plans discussed like business transactions. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was premeditated erasure. When the day of the preliminary hearing arrived, I almost didn't go. The idea of seeing him again made my chest tighten. But I went anyway, sitting straight-backed in the courtroom, my hands folded in my lap. He looked smaller than I remembered, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his eyes darting around the room until they found mine. For a moment, something like regret flickered across his face. I looked away. When Maribel testified, her voice shook at first, then steadied as she spoke. She described the bottle, the smell, the way her instincts screamed at her to act. I watched the jurors lean in, watched understanding dawn on their faces. Afterward, I hugged her tightly in the hallway. "You were so brave," I told her. She smiled through tears. "So are you." Outside the courthouse, reporters asked questions I refused to answer. I didn't owe anyone my pain. Back home, I began reclaiming small pieces of myself. I repainted the bedroom walls a soft blue he'd always said was too cold. I joined a local walking group, letting fresh air and unfamiliar faces remind me that life continued. On my birthday the following year, I didn't go out to dinner. I stayed home with Leela, baked a cake, lit candles, and made a wish, not for happiness, but for honesty. As the trial date approached, fear mixed with determination. I knew the next chapter would be hard, but I also knew this: I was still here, and that mattered more than anything he had tried to take from me. The trial began on a Monday that felt too ordinary for something so life-altering. I remember noticing the way the courthouse steps were cracked, how a pigeon hopped along the railing like any other day. It struck me then how the world doesn't pause for your pain. You just have to carry it inside and keep walking. Inside the courtroom, everything smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. I sat behind the prosecution table, my attorney beside me, while my husband sat across the room flanked by his lawyer. I still couldn't bring myself to say his name in my head. He had become something else now, someone I once loved and someone who had tried to erase me. Opening statements felt surreal, like listening to a story about strangers that somehow used my life as its script. The prosecutor spoke calmly, methodically, laying out the timeline. The affair, the debt, the plan to make my death look like a medical emergency. Each word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. When the defense stood, they tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, a moment of desperation, a man overwhelmed by financial pressure. I felt my jaw tighten. Desperation doesn't excuse premeditation. The first witnesses testified over the next few days. Financial analysts explained the hidden accounts. A detective described how the substance was traced back to a supplier linked to Aaron's cousin. Hearing her name spoken aloud in court made my stomach twist. She sat a few rows behind him, her face carefully composed, eyes downcast. When she testified, she cried, said she never thought he would actually do it, said she just wanted him free. I wondered if she had any idea what free would have cost me. When it was my turn to testify, my legs felt weak as I walked to the stand. I placed my hand on the Bible, my voice steady as I swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe my birthday dinner. I spoke slowly, carefully, letting myself feel without breaking. I described the wine, the whisper, the moment I set the glass down. When I repeated Maribel's words, "Don't drink that," a hush fell over the room. I glanced at the jury, saw tears in one woman's eyes. The defense attorney tried to rattle me on cross-examination, asked why I didn't confront my husband immediately, asked if I'd ever exaggerated his behavior in the past. I met his gaze. "I trusted my husband," I said simply. "That was my mistake, not my crime." The judge called a recess shortly after. In the hallway, Leela hugged me tightly. "You were incredible," she whispered. I shook my head. I was just honest. The days blurred together after that. Expert testimony, medical explanations, security footage from the restaurant showing my husband's hand hovering near my glass. The footage played on a loop in my mind at night, that subtle movement that almost cost me my life. One evening, after court adjourned, Maribel and I sat together on a bench outside. "I still have nightmares," she admitted, "about what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet." I squeezed her hand. "So do I said, "but we're awake now." When closing arguments came, the prosecutor spoke about intent, about choice, about how love does not look like poison slipped into a glass. The defense asked for mercy, citing his previously clean record, his role as a father. I watched Leela stiffen beside me. When the jury left to deliberate, my heart pounded so hard I thought I might be sick. Hours passed. I stared at the clock, counting seconds, breaths, memories. When they finally returned, the foreman stood. "On the charge of attempted murder," he said, "we find the defendant guilty." The word echoed in my ears. Guilty. Leela gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not joy, not relief, but certainty. The judge scheduled sentencing for a later date, but the verdict itself felt like a door closing on a life that had been quietly killing me long before that night. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. I shielded my face, not out of shame, but because my story didn't belong to strangers anymore. It belonged to me. That night, I stood in my bathroom, looked at my reflection, and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older, stronger, awake. I whispered to her, "You survived." And for the first time, I believed it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, fully, honestly, without fear. Sentencing day arrived heavy with a finality I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing that felt symbolic, nothing that drew attention. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to witness. The courtroom was quieter than it had been during the trial, as if everyone sensed this was an ending rather than a performance. When the judge asked if I wished to give a victim impact statement, my heart skipped. I had written one, rewritten it a dozen times. Still, my hands shook as I stood. I spoke about trust, about birthdays and ordinary nights that now carried shadows, about how surviving something like this changes the way you move through the world. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I simply told the truth. When I finished, I looked at him for the first time in weeks. His eyes were red, his shoulders slumped. I felt no satisfaction in that, only distance. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8. Erin received a lesser sentence for conspiracy, her tears silent as she was led away. As the gavel fell, I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot finally undone. Outside, Lila squeezed my hand. "It's over," she said. I nodded, though I knew it was only the legal part that was done. Healing doesn't follow a court calendar. Life after the trial was quieter, too quiet at first. I sold the house. Too many memories lived in those walls, too many echoes of a life that no longer fit. I moved into a smaller place near the park, somewhere sunlight spilled easily through the windows. I started volunteering at a local support center for women, sharing my story when I felt strong enough, listening when I didn't. Every time someone said, "I thought I was alone," I felt that same ache, that same understanding. Maribel came by often. She'd left restaurant work and started classes in nursing, inspired, she said, by that night. "You changed my life too," she told me once. I smiled. We saved each other. On my 45th birthday, I did go out to dinner, just me, Lila, and a few close friends. When the server brought wine, I hesitated, then laughed softly at myself. "Sparkling water," I said, not out of fear, but choice. Later that night, as candles flickered and laughter filled the room, I made another wish. Not for justice or safety or even happiness. I wished for courage, the kind that listens when something feels wrong, the kind that speaks up even when your voice shakes, because sometimes a whisper can save a life, and sometimes it can give you one back. In the months that followed, I learned that healing isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with announcements or clear milestones. It comes quietly, in moments so small you almost miss them. The first time I slept through the night without waking in a panic. The first morning I made coffee and realized my hands weren't shaking. The first time I laughed without immediately feeling guilty for it. Those were the victories no one saw. I went back to work part-time at first. Walking into my office felt strange, like stepping into a version of myself that had been frozen in time. Coworkers looked at me differently now, with a mix of sympathy and awe that made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to be brave. I wanted to be normal, but normal had changed. I found myself more honest than I'd ever been. When something felt wrong, I said so. When I was tired, I rested. When I didn't want to explain myself, I didn't. It felt like learning a new language, one where my own needs finally mattered. Lila eventually returned to college, though she called every day at first. "Just checking in," she'd say, trying to sound casual. I let her. We'd both been changed by what happened, bound together by a truth neither of us could forget. One afternoon, I received a letter from prison. His handwriting was familiar, looping, careful. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. He wrote about regret, about how he'd lost everything, about how he hoped I could forgive him someday. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a gift you owe someone. It's a choice you make when you're ready, if you ever are. I wasn't there yet. Maybe I never would be, and that was okay. I focused instead on building something new. I took a pottery class. My first bowl collapsed in on itself, and I laughed harder than I had in years. There was something comforting about shaping clay, about creating something imperfect and still calling it beautiful. I walked in the park every morning, watching seasons change, reminding myself that time moves forward whether you're ready or not. One evening, Maribel and I sat on my balcony, watching the sky turn pink and gold. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "Every day," I admitted, "but not the way I used to." She nodded. "Me too." We sat in silence for a while, comfortable, connected by a shared memory that no longer controlled us. As another year passed, I felt stronger, not unbreakable, but grounded. I had faced the worst betrayal imaginable and was still standing, still choosing to wake up, to trust myself, to believe in kindness. And sometimes, when I caught my reflection in a window or mirror, I saw not a victim, but a woman who listened when her life whispered for her attention and survived because of it. By the time the second anniversary of that birthday came around, the memory no longer felt like a knife pressed against my ribs. It was still sharp, still tender in places, but it no longer defined every breath I took. I marked the day quietly, lighting a candle in the morning and letting it burn down while I sat with my thoughts. Not in mourning, but in acknowledgement. Some days change you forever, and pretending otherwise only delays the truth. I had learned to live alongside the memory instead of inside it. Life kept offering small invitations forward. A neighbor invited me to join a book club. I said yes, even though part of me wanted to hide. Sitting in a circle of women discussing stories of loss and resilience, I realized how universal pain was, how different the details, but how similar the feelings underneath. Trust broken, love misplaced, strength rediscovered. I began speaking more regularly at the support center, not as someone who had all the answers, but as proof that survival didn't have to look heroic to be real. One afternoon, a woman pulled me aside after a session, her eyes red, her hands trembling. "I almost didn't listen," she whispered, "but your story, it made me pay attention." I hugged her, understanding in a way I never wanted to, but now carried with care. Paying attention can save you. In late autumn, I received another letter from prison. I didn't open it this time. I returned it unopened, not out of anger, but clarity. Some chapters don't need revisiting to be closed. Leela graduated that spring. Watching her walk across the stage, her smile bright and unburdened, I felt a pride so fierce it brought tears to my eyes. She had seen the worst of what love could become and still chose hope. That, to me, was everything. After the ceremony, she hugged me tightly. "You taught me something," she said, "that love shouldn't cost you your voice." I held her a little longer than necessary, letting that truth sink deep. On a quiet evening not long after, Maribel came by with a small gift. Inside the box was a simple bracelet, delicate, with a tiny charm shaped like an ear. I laughed softly. "For listening," she said, "and for being listened to." I slipped it on, feeling the weight of meaning settle warmly against my wrist. Sometimes I touched it absent-mindedly, a reminder not of fear, but of awareness, of intuition, of courage. As winter approached, I found myself thinking less about what had almost happened and more about what still could. Travel, new friendships, maybe even love someday, though I no longer rushed that thought. I had learned that being whole on my own was not loneliness, it was freedom. On the night before my birthday, I sat by the window, watching snow fall softly under the streetlights. I thought about the waitress who had whispered to me, the daughter who had held me together, the woman I had been before and the one I was now. I raised a glass of sparkling water to my reflection in the dark glass and smiled. I was still here, still listening, still choosing myself. On the morning of my 46th birthday, I woke up before the alarm, the room washed in soft, early light. There was no heaviness in my chest, no sudden rush of memories pulling me backward. Instead, there was a quiet sense of presence, the kind that comes when you're fully in your body, in your life, without bracing for impact. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching people hurry down the sidewalk, each carrying stories no one else could see. I realized then that what had happened to me was no longer the first thing I thought about when I opened my eyes. That alone felt like a miracle. I spent that day doing ordinary things. I went for a long walk in the park, the bracelet Maribel gave me catching the light as my arms swung gently by my side. I bought myself flowers at the corner shop, yellow ones that felt hopeful without trying too hard. I cooked dinner just for me, music playing softly in the background, and for the first time in years, the sound filled the space instead of highlighting emptiness. That evening, Leela called from across the country, her voice bright and full of plans. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said. I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "I'm proud of you too," I replied. After we hung up, I sat with that feeling, letting it settle. Pride. Not survival pride, but something deeper. The pride of choosing honesty again and again, even when it hurt. A few weeks later, I received a message from Maribel. She'd been accepted into a nursing program. "You're the first person I wanted to tell," she wrote. We celebrated with coffee and laughter, talking about the future like it was something wide and welcoming instead of uncertain and dangerous. Watching her talk excitedly about her classes, I thought about how a single moment of courage can ripple outward, changing lives you never meant to touch. I continued speaking at the support center, though my role shifted over time. I stopped focusing on the details of what happened to me and started talking more about what came after, about rebuilding trust with yourself, about the difference between silence that keeps you safe and silence that keeps you trapped. People listened. Some cried, some nodded quietly, like something inside them had been named for the first time. One afternoon, after a session, I lingered alone in the room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. I thought about the woman I'd been at that birthday dinner years ago, lifting a glass she trusted without question. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her something, not a warning, but a reassurance, that even if the worst truth came out, she would survive it. More than that, she would grow into someone who trusted her instincts, honored her boundaries, and understood her worth in a way she never had before. I never did forgive my husband in the way people often expect. There was no dramatic confrontation, no letter of closure. Instead, I let go of the need to carry his actions with me. I stopped giving him space in my thoughts. I stopped wondering how he was doing, whether prison had changed him, whether he felt remorse on quiet nights. His story no longer required my attention. Mine did. Occasionally, someone would ask if I was afraid to trust again. I'd think about it carefully before answering. "I'm not afraid of trust," I'd say. "I'm afraid of ignoring myself." There's a difference. Trust, I learned, isn't blind. It's built slowly, with listening, with observation, with respect for the quiet signals your body sends when something isn't right. As the years passed, the memory of that whisper in the restaurant became less about fear and more about connection. A stranger seeing another woman and choosing to care, choosing to risk discomfort, consequences, uncertainty, just to say something, just to intervene. That was the real gift, not just my life being saved, but my faith in humanity being restored in the most unexpected way. On another quiet evening, I sat at my kitchen table writing in a journal, something I'd started doing regularly. I wrote about gratitude, not the performative kind, but the honest kind. Gratitude for my daughter's strength, for Maribel's courage, for my own resilience, discovered not because I wanted it, but because I needed it. I wrote about how pain can sharpen your senses, but healing teaches you when to rest them. When I finished, I closed the notebook and sat in the silence, feeling complete in a way I hadn't known before. If there is a lesson in my story, it isn't about danger lurking in every glass or betrayal hiding behind every smile. It's about listening to the small hesitations, to the quiet discomfort, to the voice inside you that notices when something feels off, even if you can't explain why. That voice is not paranoia.
It's wisdom, and sometimes it speaks through others, through strangers who remind you that you are worth protecting, even when you've forgotten it yourself. I am still here, not because I was lucky, though luck played its part. I'm here because someone paid attention and because I eventually learned to do the same. My life didn't end at that birthday dinner. It began again, shaped by truth, steadied by awareness, and guided by a promise I made to myself to never ignore my own voice again, no matter how softly it speaks. Some stories don't end with a final event. They taper off slowly, like a song fading into silence. This is one of those stories. Years have passed now, enough that the sharp edges have softened, enough that the memory of that night feels more like a chapter I once lived than a place I still occupy. I still remember it, of course. I always will. But it no longer owns me. It sits where it belongs, in the past, informing who I am without deciding who I get to be. I moved again, this time not out of pain, but out of curiosity. A small coastal town where the mornings smell like salt and the evenings carry the sound of waves instead of traffic. I wanted to know what it felt like to choose something simply because it called to me. I rented a modest house with a porch that catches the sunset just right. Some nights I sit out there with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the world breathe. Peace, I've learned, is not the absence of memory, it's the absence of fear attached to it. I still wear Maribel's bracelet. The little ear charm has dulled with time, but I like that. It reminds me that awareness doesn't have to shine to be powerful. Sometimes it's quiet, worn smooth through use. Maribel finished nursing school and now works in an emergency department. She says every shift reminds her why she chose this path. We don't talk as often as we once did, but when we do, it's easy, like no time has passed. Some people enter your life for a reason, not a season, even if the form of the connection changes. Lila visits when she can. She's building her own life now, strong and thoughtful, with boundaries I wish I'd learned sooner. Watching her navigate the world with clarity instead of fear is one of my greatest comforts. She once told me, "What happened to you didn't make me scared of love, it made me serious about respect." I carry that sentence with me like a blessing. Occasionally, I'm asked to speak at events or write about my experience. Sometimes I say yes, sometimes I don't. I've learned that I don't owe my story to anyone, but I can offer it when it feels right. When I do speak, I notice the same thing every time. People lean in not during the shocking parts, but during the quiet ones, the moment of hesitation, the whisper, the choice to listen. That's where they see themselves. I've never heard from my husband again, not directly. I know he was denied parole at his first hearing. I felt nothing when I found out. No satisfaction, no anger, just distance. Indifference, it turns out, is the real opposite of love. Forgiveness may come someday in its own form, but it will never be a doorway back. Some doors are meant to stay closed so you can keep moving forward. On my birthdays now, I celebrate differently. Not extravagantly, not quietly either. Intentionally. I eat what I want, I drink what I choose, I surround myself with people who don't make me feel small or uncertain, and every year, before the day ends, I take a moment alone, just to check in with myself, just to listen, because the most important relationship I rebuilt after everything was the one with my own instincts. If you're listening to this and something in your life feels slightly off, not dramatic, not dangerous, just wrong, I hope you don't ignore it. I hope you don't talk yourself out of what your body already knows. You don't need proof to pause. You don't need permission to protect yourself. And you don't need to wait for disaster to choose honesty. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is set the glass down. My life is quieter now. Smaller in some ways, but it is honest and it is mine. I am still here, not defined by what almost happened, but shaped by what I chose afterward, to listen, to leave, to live. There is one last thing I want to tell you, and it isn't about poison or courtrooms or betrayal. It's about what happens long after the danger is past, when no one is watching anymore, when the adrenaline fades and you're left alone with yourself.
That part doesn't make the news. It doesn't fit neatly into a dramatic headline. But it's the part that decides whether you merely survived or whether you truly healed. For a long time, I thought healing meant never thinking about that night again. I chased that kind of forgetting, tried to outrun the memory by staying busy, by being useful, by being strong for everyone else. But forgetting was never the goal. Integration was. Learning how to carry the truth without letting it crush me. Learning how to remember without reliving. The day I understood that, something inside me finally settled. I remember one quiet afternoon in the coastal town, months after I'd moved. I was standing in line at a small cafe, sunlight slanting across the floor, when the woman in front of me suddenly swayed. Just for a second, barely noticeable, but something in her posture changed, the same subtle shift I'd once ignored in myself so many times. Without thinking, I reached out and steadied her. She laughed it off, embarrassed, said she'd skip breakfast. But as she thanked me, her eyes softened in that way people do when they realize someone noticed, when they realize they weren't invisible. I walked away with my coffee trembling slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. That was who I had become. Someone who noticed, someone who listened, someone who trusted that quiet inner nudge instead of dismissing it as imagination or overreaction. Trauma had taken many things from me, but it had given me that in return. Attentiveness, not hypervigilance rooted in fear, but awareness rooted in care. The kind that connects instead of isolates. Over time, I stopped thinking of myself as the woman whose husband tried to kill her. That description, while true, was incomplete. I was also the woman who lived, the woman who rebuilt, the woman who learned that love without safety is not love at all, and that peace should never feel like walking on glass. I was the woman who learned that intuition doesn't shout, it whispers, and it deserves respect. Sometimes people ask me if I miss the life I had before. The answer is complicated. I miss the innocence. I miss believing that loyalty alone could protect you. I miss the ease of assuming good intentions without question. But I don't miss the silence. I don't miss shrinking. I don't miss explaining away discomfort just to keep the surface smooth. The life I have now may be quieter, but it is solid. It doesn't require me to disappear to function. I've learned to sit with myself in silence and feel content instead of uneasy. I've learned that being alone is not the same as being lonely. And I've learned that trust begins inward, not outward. The last time I spoke to Maribel, she told me about a patient she'd advocated for when no one else was listening. "I kept thinking about you," she said. I smiled at that, not because I wanted to be remembered for what happened, but because it meant the chain of listening continued, one person paying attention, then another, then another. That's how harm gets interrupted, not always dramatically, often quietly, often in moments no one ever hears about. And maybe that's the real ending of this story, not the verdict, not the sentencing, not even my survival, but the way one whispered warning echoed forward into a life lived differently, into choices made more consciously, into a woman who no longer second-guesses the feeling that says, pause, look closer, protect yourself. If you take anything with you from my story, let it be this: you are allowed to stop mid-sip, mid-sentence, mid-relationship, mid-life. You are allowed to change your mind when something doesn't feel right, even if you can't explain why, especially then. You don't owe politeness at the expense of your safety. You don't owe silence at the expense of your truth. And you don't owe anyone access to you just because they once earned your trust. Sometimes survival looks dramatic. Sometimes it looks like ambulances and courtrooms and headlines. But more often, it looks like a small, quiet decision no one else notices. A glass set down, a boundary drawn, a voice finally heard. My story began with a whisper that saved my life. It ends with a promise I keep every day.
to listen, to choose myself, and to never ignore that quiet inner voice again, no matter how softly it speaks.